Hi, thank you guys for coming. My name is Chad. I'm a postdoc, and this is going to be an idea talk. And the purpose of this is to get you guys thinking about sexual transmission, looking for sexual transmission in your own systems, and thinking about how that might influence host reproductive behavior. So, sex is one of the most intimate social behaviors that animals engage in. And it's incredibly diverse between, reproductive behavior is incredibly diverse between taxa, of course. But within taxa, it's actually quite stereotyped. You know, there's a courtship sequence, often copulation after that, and then following copulation, in some instances, males and females continuing to interact post-mating. And this provides reliable opportunities for symbionts to be transmitted. There's this really important paper that was published in 1996 by Lockhart et al. And there's two main conclusions that they reached in the survey they did of sexually transmitted infections. The first was they found that STIs were ubiquitous in animals. They found 200 STIs in 27 orders, most of which were bacteria or viruses. And the second conclusion was that STIs cause less mortality, are longer lived in their hosts, are less likely to evoke strong immune responses, have narrow host ranges, and show less fluctuation in prevalence over time. So the two main things to take away from the review was, first of all, sexual transmission isn't some aberration. It's actually quite common. And second of all, sexually transmitted infections are actually have lower virulence than their non-sexually transmitted counterparts, which might come as a surprise, because we have this perception that sexually transmitted infections are highly virulent, and that's just simply not the case. And there's several reasons why this occurs. The most common of which is that sexual transmission requires hosts that are both in reproductive condition, are able to survive periods of reproductive dormancy, are asymptomatic with potential mates, and also they have a narrow host range, and this can lower virulence in some instances. So, how might sexually transmitted infections become beneficial? Well, there's two mechanisms that might provide a pathway for how this could occur. So the first is mixed mode transmission. This idea that sexual transmission should result in virulence is well grounded in classic theory that suggests that when pathogens are, or symbionts are exchanged between unrelated individuals, virulence can evolve. However, the opposite is true in the case of vertical transmission. When symbionts are passed from parent to offspring, the evolutionary interests of the host and the symbiont are aligned, and as a consequence of that, we see the prediction being that mutualisms should evolve as a result. And so what I expect is that with these beneficial STIs, that the amount of virulent or vertical transmission should be proportionally greater than the amount of horizontal transmission. And we simply just don't have the data to test that. But what we do know is that mixed mode transmission is very common in nature, and in all of the beneficial STIs that I know of, they all exhibit mixed mode transmission. Of course, there's a lot of beneficial symbionts that have no vertical transmission at all. And so how can we explain why they're beneficial? Well, one possibility is symbiont choice. And so in this case, hosts have some mechanism that allows them to screen out pathogenic and beneficial infections. And so in this sense, they're letting the white run in by some mechanism that the host has. In the context of sexually transmitted infections, this could be some property of the male seminal fluid or the female reproductive tract, including the rich microbiota that inhabit the female reproductive tract and are so important in preventing infection and reproductive health generally. So there's a couple of case studies I'm just going to show you to give you a flavor of what I found when I was doing this review. And the first is in pea aphids, which you've already heard something about. There are hosts to at least 7 or 8 facultative symbionts, at least 2 of which we know are sexually transmitted, and they're also vertically transmitted as well. One being Hamiltonella that was already discussed, and one being Regiella. They confer a variety of benefits, which we just heard about: parasitoid resistance, fungal resistance, and heat tolerance. And interestingly, if you look at nature, you see phylogenetic evidence of horizontal transmission among lineages of the same species. And so sexual transmission could be one of the answers of why you see this pattern. The second case study that I wanted to share with you is GBVC in humans. GBVC is a lymphotropic RNA virus that doesn't have any known adverse health effects. And in the 90s, they started noticing in some studies they were doing that patients that were infected with GBVC had higher survival if they were HIV positive. And so there was this meta-analysis that was done in 2006 that's shown here, and what they found is looking across all these studies, co-infection was associated with a 59% reduction in mortality for HIV patients that were seropositive for at least 2 years. And there's some mechanistic evidence of how this occurs, both directly by interfering with HIV infecting and replicating in the host cells, and also by stimulating the host immune response. There's another paper that showed that GVC is also vertically transmitted and provides protection for offspring. So they're less likely to acquire HIV from their mothers if they get GVC. So I'm personally very interested in reproductive behavior, and so what might be some of the consequences of beneficial STIs? Well, actually there was a paper that was already published on this in 1999, and what Lombardo et al. Were arguing is that beneficial STIs could have important implications for both mate choice and the evolution of promiscuity. So no study of days actually examined whether beneficial STIs influence mate choice, and the fact that symbionts affect host behavior is well established since Hamilton and Zuck proposed that parasites could influence mate choice decisions. However, there's no reason to expect that this can also be the case for beneficial infections as well. So I think this is an area of research that deserves some attention. In terms of the evolution of mate choice itself, it's completely consistent with the framework that we already have, so we don't need something new to explain how this could evolve. Obviously, there could be direct benefits by having a particular preference. So by preferring infected individuals and acquiring that symbiont, you can reap the benefits, increasing your own survivorship of fecundity. There's also possibility for indirect benefits to affect the evolution of the preference, both through good genes and what I'm calling good metagenomes in the case of vertical transmission. So by mating with an infected individual and passing that to your offspring then have higher survival and fecundity from that interaction. And then finally, there could be something more complicated going on, such as genomic interactions between hosts and symbionts that affect whether or not that symbiont is beneficial or not. And that would lead to more complicated dynamics in terms of the evolution of the preference, as is seen in cases where you just look at interactions between male and female genomes in how well offspring grow, survive, etc. Finally, there's an important difference, though, between the case of pathogenic STIs and beneficial STIs. And that is, in the case of beneficial STIs, the host and the symbiont interests are actually aligned. And I think this should facilitate the evolution of systems for advertisement detection, because there isn't selection on the infected individual to mask the fact that they have this disease that could be detrimental to someone that would mate with them. And so because of this synergism, I think that it's more likely you'd actually see the evolution of this communication system in the context of mate choice. So mechanistically, how might this operate? Well, there's two ways I can think of that this could occur. So the first is there could be some condition dependence, which is analogous to what Hamilton and Zuck proposed for pathogenic parasites. And that is individuals in better condition are just more likely to have beneficial symbionts. So by preferring, for example, males that have elaborate plumage or are in good condition, one has a higher likelihood of also acquiring a symbiont from that male because the symbiont is influencing the ability of that male to have that particular trait. The second is a little more particular to microbes, and that is the signal production or fermentation hypothesis. And there's been some really exciting work that's been coming out looking at how microbes actually can directly participate in the production of signals that hosts produce. Things like particular hydrocarbons in flies, scent marks in hyenas, individual recognition of MHC in mice, and also spectral properties of plumage in birds. And so in this case, if an individual is infected with a particular symbiont, the symbiont's actually manipulating that signal, and that could influence, or more likely that if you mate with that individual, that you would acquire that beneficial symbiont. So the second class of behaviors that I wanted to discuss is the evolution of polyandry. So there's a general acceptance in behavioral ecology that polyandry is common because it's adaptive. It's providing some benefit to females to mate with more than one male. And again, in this paper by Lombardo in 1999, they suggested the benefit of polyandry could be the acquisition of beneficial symbionts that are circulating in the population. So this requires a couple of things. So first of all, STIs have to provide some kind of fitness advantage to the host, and I've shown you a couple of examples where that's the case. Multiple mating has to increase the likelihood of symbiont acquisition. And finally, the benefit of acquiring the beneficial symbiont has to outweigh the costs of promiscuity. And so the costs could be anything from other circulating pathogenic STIs in the population to the more traditional costs we think of, like exposure to predation, etc. And so that would be required in order to have an evolutionary response to beneficial STIs that are circulating. So there actually there have been some studies that have looked at how reproductive behavior affects microbial communities, in this case, female reproductive tracts, in common lizards, in permiscus mice, and across 9 primate species. And what all these studies have shown is that females that are polyandrous have both a higher diversity of symbionts in the female reproductive tract, and also have different community structure. And so what they suggest at least is that if females are more polyandrous, they are sampling the diversity of microbes that are circulating in the population. And of course, what we don't know from these studies is the functional consequences of a difference in symbiont community. But I think now we're starting to develop techniques and are actually able to answer those functional questions. So I think it's a really exciting time to start looking at these patterns and asking, well, what are the functional consequences for the host? So just to close, the one main question that needs to be answered is, these beneficial STIs, are they rare or are they just under study? Is it just that we have this perception that sexual transmission necessarily has to be pathogenic, and thus we should be looking in these places for sexually transmitted beneficial symbionts? And what I'd like you to do is think about, well, in my system, what different ways might we be able to explore how sexual transmission should occur? And we often think about reproductive fluids as being the main avenue, and certainly that would be a cool place to look. But during sex, there's all kinds of other behavioral interactions, including things like the exchange of nuptial gifts, courtship, etc., etc. And so I think we need to look broadly and ask, well, how can all these different aspects of sexual behavior influence symbiont transmission? So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
GBVC finding is like really fascinating. I've never heard anything about it. Is the medical community doing anything with that? As a way of perhaps treatment?
Not that I'm aware of, and I think it's definitely not ready for clinical application, right? And there's a lot of controversy surrounding how it could actually be used, and of course they need to understand the mechanism, and that's where there's a lot of effort now. Yeah. Yes.
So is it possible to conjecture from the existing data whether beneficial symbionts evolved to be sexually transmitted, or whether sexually transmitted symbionts evolved to be beneficial?
Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that. Although we do know from other studies, like for example, Joe Sachs has shown that beneficial and pathogenic STIs are all mixed up in the phylogenetic tree. And so understanding those transitions and the conditions that are associated with transitions from being either non-sexual to sexual or being pathogenic to beneficial is just a really important area in microbial ecology right now and evolution. And I think it just remains to be seen. But we just need to get out there and start looking for beneficial STIs. I just think that people haven't been looking for it, and I think if we do, we'd have a data set to be able to answer questions like that.
I have kind of a follow-up to that question, because the relationships are really dynamic, so when you can be parasitic at some point, and then maybe that's why they're mixed, the parasitic and beneficial symbiosis. Because that, we'll go back, and that's exactly the case. I mean, it can be parasitic, but then it can protect you against some other parasite. And then at some point, it's going to be effectively mutualistic. Have you given some thought to that and how that can explain this mixing of beneficial and parasitic symbiosis in the tree? Like in a specific case or in general?
Well, so anything sexually transmitted is is also likely to be facultative as well. And when you have that situation, there's certainly opportunity for the cost of benefits to vary depending upon the environment. So I think that's certainly a possibility, but I can't really comment much more beyond that.
Okay, this is the end of the second section. Maybe thank the speakers again, everyone, and thank you for being here.